Hello there everyone. Welcome back to Disclosures of the Third Kind. This is going to be episode 2, the Majestic-12 documents. I do hope you will enjoy this. It's a topic which I've been wanting to cover for a very long time. In this second episode, I want to take a closer look at one of the most controversial and enduring mysteries in UFO history. So, why were they genuine? I think that's the one question everybody wants to know, including myself. Were they part of a disinformation campaign? Or were they a mixture of truth and deception designed to point researchers in one direction while hiding something else entirely? That is the question, indeed. Tonight I want to explore several other key questions related to these documents. Why is James Forrestal's death in 1949 so often brought into this discussion? Why does the Majestic-12 material focus so heavily on Roswell and a later crash in Mexico on the 6th of December 1950, yet appears to say nothing about Aztec? And why does a name that appears in the Roswell story, Hoyt Vandenberg, also appear in the Majestic-12 narrative? So, I've been doing some work on the Ramey memo for my book Beyond Roswell, Cold War Cover-Ups and Conspiracy Theories, and it's out there if you're interested on Amazon. Hoyt Vandenberg's name is mentioned at the top of that document, which is very interesting as he was himself in the Majestic-12, but we will come back to that later. So for me, those links are where things begin to get very interesting. Okay. The Majestic-12 documents, sometimes called MJ-12 papers, emerged publicly in the 1980s and were presented as secret government briefing materials describing a highly classified group formed to manage the recovery and study of crashed extraterrestrial craft. According to those documents, Majestic-12 was allegedly created in the aftermath of the Roswell incident under the authority of Mr. President Harry S. Truman. This included some of the most powerful military, intelligence and scientific figures in the United States. From the very beginning, the document split researchers basically into two camps. One side saw them as potentially explosive, being evidence of a long-running crash retrieval program. The other side dismissed them as an elaborate hoax or disinformation effort, perhaps based loosely on real names, real structures, and real events. And to be fair, both positions have good reasons behind them. Because when you examine the MJ-12 papers, you find something very strange. They are, in my opinion, either an incredibly detailed and clever fabrication, or they preserve fragments of a deeply buried truth. Now, there is some truth behind the potential disinformation of these documents. In 1988, Bill Moore, who co-authored the book, The Roswell Incident in 1980, came forward saying he'd been part of a disinformation campaign working with OSI, that's Air Force Office of Special Intelligence, with Richard Doty. So the Majestic-12 documents were part of his basically big reveal. When he came out and said he'd been part of a disinformation campaign, the documents were straight away dismissed. The FBI also examined the documents in 1984, I believe, declared them to be a hoax. Again, if you didn't want these documents to be revealed, you would declare them as a hoax, and potentially the FBI. We know the FBI and the CIA worked closely in the late 1940s, early 50s with the Air Force and other groups to examine UFOs. So potentially, yes, they could be part of the cover-up, but the evidence hasn't surfaced for that yet. What I want to look at now, and I find it very interesting, is Secretary James Forrestal, his death and his association with the Majestic-12. So one of the most unsettling names connected to this whole story is James Forrestal. Forrestal was the first United States Secretary of Defense and a man deeply embedded in the national security world at the highest possible level. He died tragically on the 22nd of May 1949 after falling from a window at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Now, my ultimate opinion and theories on this is that he was pushed either by someone hired by the Majestic-12 or a Majestic-12 internal member. That's my theory. I think there's too much coincidence in this for him just to have taken his life. Officially, his death was ruled a suicide, but for decades, people have questioned the circumstances around it. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that Forrestal was killed because of Majestic-12. That is a serious claim, and again, like I said, my personal theory is that I think they had something to do with it, but again, we haven't got the evidence to prove that as of yet. What I am saying is this: if a secretive control group like Majestic-12 did exist, Forrestal would have been exactly the sort of man who might have known something about it, or at the very least, moved within the circles where such knowledge was held. It's been said by ufologists and researchers that Mr. Forrestal wanted the information out into the public sphere, the UFO information, that is. This could be the reason that he was taken off the scene. Again, there's no evidence to prove that, but that would link that together. So his death created a vacuum in that upper level structure of power. And that leads us to General Walter Bedell Smith. If Forrestal was removed from the picture in 1949, then the path is open for Walter B. Smith to become even more central in the intelligence and national security apparatus in the MJ-12 narrative. That kind of personnel shift matters. These were not ordinary men in ordinary offices. These were individuals at the very top of the post-war security state. So one of the questions I think we have to ask is this: was Forrestal's death simply a tragic event within a difficult personal and political period, or was his removal one of those moments that quietly reshaped who controlled the deepest secrets of the early Cold War? That question, ladies and gentlemen, remains open, but it is not a question that is by any means trivial. It deserves an explanation. Now we come to one of the biggest issues I have with the Majestic-12 documents. Why is Aztec not mentioned? It's a very important event, and plenty of information and proof is now surfacing thanks to Scott Ramsey and William S. Steinman. If the documents are authentic, and if multiple crash retrieval events really occurred, then the absence of Aztec is interesting. There are two obvious possibilities here. The first is that Aztec was compartmentalized elsewhere, which is possible. In other words, Roswell may have sat within one channel of secrecy while Aztec was handled by another faction, another office, or another compartment entirely. If that were the case, the absence of Aztec would not necessarily disprove MJ-12. It might simply show us that even within the hidden world, information was divided and restricted. The second possibility is that the omission is deliberate because the documents themselves are part of an elaborate disinformation strategy. This is the argument many researchers have made over the years, that the MJ-12 papers may have been designed to steer attention towards certain cases while away from others, to reveal just enough to create confusion and to muddy the waters between truth and fabrication. That possibility cannot be ignored. And in many ways, the fact that Aztec is absent may be just as revealing as anything that is actually written into the documents. Because if Aztec was real, then why leave this out? And if Aztec was false, then why do so many independent threads keep circling back to it? That silence to me is one of the most suspicious parts of the whole Majestic-12 picture. Now I want to look at Roswell, Mexico and the 1950 crash. The MJ-12 material does not just anchor itself to Roswell. It also points to a crash in Mexico on the 6th of December 1950. Significant because it suggests a pattern, not a single isolated event, but multiple recoveries over time. If genuine, that would imply a continuing retrieval effort and a system already in place to contain, study and compartmentalise these events. Roswell then becomes not the beginning and the end of the story, but one chapter in an ongoing program. That idea also helps explain why the documents read the way they do. They are less like a dramatic revelation and more like bureaucratic briefing papers from a system that had already begun normalising the extraordinary. And that in itself is quite chilling. Because if these documents were real, they suggest that by the early 1950s, the recovery and study of non-human technology had already become an organised intelligence function. So I'm now going to look at Hoyt Vandenberg and the Ramey memo, which is a very interesting part. Now, many good researchers have done big reveals on the Ramey memo. Those of David Rudiak, David Jones, and even myself now in Beyond Roswell, Cold War Cover-Ups and Conspiracy Theories. We have the technology today to read those documents, and what's on there is quite revealing. Talks of recovery of victims, crashed discs being sent to Wright Field, Ohio for testing. But what is even more interesting is the fact that Hoyt Vandenberg appears at the top of the Ramey memo, so it's directed to Hoyt Vandenberg from Ramey by the looks of things. His name appears in discussions around the Roswell case because of the well-known Ramey memo. The blurred memo seen in General Ramey's hand in the famous photographs taken in Fort Worth. That was on July 8th, 1947. Researchers have debated that memo for years, trying to determine whether it contained references to weather balloons, wreckage discs, victims, or something else entirely. Now, separate from that debate, the important point here is that Vandenberg's name is part of the Roswell era world, and in the MJ-12 papers, he is also presented as one of the key figures. That overlap is extremely important, in my opinion, because even if one remains cautious about the documents, seeing the same names emerge in multiple connected contexts and documents raises legitimate questions. Was Vandenberg simply a senior military figure whose name would naturally turn up in several major post-war matters? Or does his appearance in both areas point to a more direct line between the Roswell event and the alleged Majestic-12 group? To me, that link is difficult to dismiss casually. It does not prove the documents are real, but it does add weight to the idea that the authors, whether genuine insiders or highly informed fabricators, knew exactly which names mattered. And that is the most important part of the case. And that is why the MJ-12 papers can never be fully dismissed. So, are they real, fake, or are they both? This is where I think the conversation becomes most interesting. Too often, people reduce the Majestic-12 question to a simple yes or no. And I myself have been questioned on that in the past, but I'm here to change that. Either the documents are real or they are fake. But what if that is too simplistic? What if the truth is much messier? What if the documents contain real names, real structures, real anxieties, and perhaps fragments of genuine history, but are wrapped in layers of disinformation and deliberate manipulation. That would explain a great deal, in my opinion. It would explain why some details feel persuasive. It would explain why other elements feel staged. And it would explain why the documents continue to divide researchers so deeply. A pure hoax is one thing. A document seeded with truth, half-truth, and deception is something else entirely. And if intelligence agencies did want to conceal a real crash retrieval program, that second method would be far more effective. So, after revealing all the information in this video, looking at the different points and the evidence suggested, where do I stand today? Well, I think the Majestic-12 documents remain deeply controversial, for good reason. I myself understand why many people reject them. There are problems, inconsistencies, and reasons for caution, but I also think there are enough intriguing links, enough meaningful names, dates, and overlaps to prevent the subject from being dismissed outright. For me, the silence around Aztec, the presence of Roswell, the inclusion of the 1950 Mexico crash, the question of Forrestal's death, and the appearance of names like Hoyt Vandenberg all combine into something that deserves serious scrutiny. Whether MJ12 was a genuine control group, a partial leak, or a masterful disinformation exercise, the documents tell us something important. By the time they surfaced, there was already a hidden architecture of suspicion around Roswell, military intelligence, and recovered technology. And perhaps that hidden architecture was there for a reason. Thank you very much again, folks, and let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think the Majestic-12 documents are genuine? Do you think they are disinformation? And what do you make of the absence of Aztec? It's not often discussed, but it's a very important part of the case. And again, if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Disclosures of the Third Kind.